Welcome to video 4 in our genetic video series. Today we're going to be talking specifically about genetic traits. Now before watching this video, please make sure that you have read and answered the What is DNA questions, watched the DNA Basics video, taken the quiz on DNA Basics, watched mRNA transcription video, read and answered the transcription and translation overview questions, taken the quiz on transcription and hopefully passed, watched the protein translation video, read and answered the protein translation questions, read and answered the danger of giving bad directions reading. This one's also really important because we're going to be talking about a lot about mutations today, which was the main focus of that reading. And last but not least, taken the quiz on translation and hopefully passed that one as well. Today, as you follow along with the reading called Genetic Traits. There's a couple of vocab words that you should definitely follow along on, and then there's also some work together questions that we're going to do before you get started on the work on your own. Now remember, all these videos relate back to this one molecule right here, DNA. And remember why it's so important, because in each of the letter sequences that we have, A, C, T, C, that specific sequence of letters is what's going to control the proteins that are made inside of our body. And those proteins are pretty much going to control everything that we do. Now, as another quick review from previous videos, what we've seen is the process of turning DNA into RNA is called transcription, and it occurs in the nucleus. All right, now the purpose behind that particular process is, remember, the DNA is trapped inside of the nucleus, so in order to protect it. But the ribosomes, which make the proteins, need the information from the DNA. How do we solve that? Well, we make this fun mRNA, this messenger molecule that sends the information out to the ribosome. Now, once the ribosome gets to once the RNA gets to the ribosome, whoop, it makes amino acid chains through a process known as translation. Those amino acid chains link together in a long chain, and all of a sudden you get yourself protein. Now, why is this important? Well, it's all going to relate back to these idea of chromosomes, is that all of the proteins that we have in our body come to us because of DNA that we get from our parents. All right, now the interesting thing about this DNA, though, is that not all the DNA is exactly the same. You'll remember from our first video that we actually have 23 pairs of chromosomes. All right, now the reason why these pairs exist is because from each parent we get a chunk of DNA which is almost exactly the same. All right, so what would happen is each of these chromosomes, we got one from mom and one from dad. So we probably got, it really, no one can really know, but maybe we got this one from dad and this one from mom. And on each chromosome, what you actually see is that the information that's coded for in this chunk here is almost the same information that's coded for in this chunk here. Maybe that's eye color, maybe that's height, maybe that's toenail growth rate. All right, any of those things, but it's almost exactly the same. But there are a few differences that can occur. All right, and here is a great example of some of the differences. This is eye color that we're looking at here. The difference between brown eyes and blue eyes. Now, how does this come about? Well, it starts off with this molecule right here called melanin. All right, melanin is the protein responsible for making the brown pigment that we see inside of our eyes. And now what's represented here is really just a chunk of the chemical structure, but you can see some of the amino acids stuck together in a chain. So here's one amino acid right here. All right, and you'll notice that it's connected in a chain. Now, there's links here, there's a link here, and there would be another link here, as this would kind of continue on to make a longer chain of amino acids. This is just one part of the melanin. All right, but this is some of the amino acids in the chain that make the brown protein. So you combine this melanin, put it into an eyeball, and all of a sudden you get brown eyes. All right, like this gentleman here. But here's the interesting thing about some of these proteins and DNA sequences. As you read with the danger of giving bad directions in that reading, it's very easy to change that letter sequence from DNA. If you change the DNA sequence, you change the RNA sequence. If you change the RNA sequence, you change the order of amino acids. If you change the order of amino acids, all of a sudden you have a completely different protein, or at least a protein that's a little bit different. All right, whereas the protein melanin makes brown eyes, you change a little bit of it, so you only change these few amino acids right here, so it actually equates to about 3 amino acids that are different, and all of a sudden you get this new substance called phenylalanine. Now, you may have already predicted it. Eumelanin causes brown eyes, whereas phosphomelananin results in blue eyes. Aw, how cute. All right, so how does this connect to what we're going to be talking about? Well, what we're going to be talking about is how do our parents give us some of these traits, and how does this start to play out and maybe being able to predict what kind of traits our own kids would have? It all comes back to these pairs of chromosomes again. Remember, just like you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, each of your parents had 23 pairs of chromosomes. All right, they got one of their sets of chromosomes from their mom and one of their sets of chromosomes from their dad. Now, how this actually plays out physiologically essentially breaks down in sperm and egg production. So what we have here, if you could imagine a split here, on the left-hand side we have your dad, and on the right-hand side we have your mom, and each of them are making some reproductive cells. All right, your dad is making sperm and your mom is making eggs. And what happens is that your dad's DNA, all of his chromosomes, actually split every time that he makes sperm. So what happens is that half of those chromosomes go into one sperm, the other half go into a different sperm. And it's complete random chance as to which one goes in which sperm. The same thing will happen with your mom, is that half her DNA will go into one egg and half of her DNA will go into another egg. And again, it's completely random. So that if we were to look at something like this, in one sperm, your dad might put this chromosome and this chromosome, but also put this chromosome and this chromosome and this chromosome and this chromosome and that one 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 and so on. And it's completely random which one. Is it the left one? Is it the right one? Who really knows? All right, because it's a completely random 50-50 chance as to which one he puts in each sperm. And the same thing for your mom as to which one she puts in each egg. And what it results in is that even siblings, so with two of the same parents, can have very different looks because it completely depends on which genes your parents gave you. All right, in this case, we're going to investigate that a little bit more with eye color. Now, some of these examples are really similar. Let's say that for eye color, so for the one trait of eye color, your dad has one gene that codes for brown eyes, and the other gene also codes for brown eyes. Your mom, one of her genes codes for brown eyes, so eumelanin. The other gene also codes for brown eyes, for eumelanin. And so what would then happen if we were able to play this out is that dad could donate brown to little Sammy here, and mom could donate brown eyes to little Sammy here. And what color eyes would Sammy have? Well, he'd have brown eyes. All right, now the same would be true for blue eyes. Let's say in this family case where dad has half of his genes make phosphomelananin, the blue protein, and the other half of his genes also make phosphomelananin. Half of mom's genes make phosphomelananin, the other half of her genes make phosphomelananin, which means each parent will donate phosphomelananin making genes to their child, and now this little Jimmy here has blue eyes. That's pretty easy and obvious. The tricky part comes when you get a situation like this, whereas dad has maybe two brown-eyed genes, but mom has two blue-eyed genes. So in this case, dad will give little Mark here brown eyes, but mom will donate her blue eye trait. In this case, what do you think would happen? Would little Mark here have brown eyes, or would little Mark here have blue eyes? If you guessed blue, you're wrong. It's actually brown. All right, in this case, if you have half of your genes coding for brown eyes and half of your genes coding for blue eyes, you will only see the brown. Now, this is a really interesting part of genetics in that what we have are some traits are what are called dominant and other traits are recessive. In this case, the brown eye trait is dominant over the blue eye trait. What does this dominant and recessive thing mean? Well, if you have two dominant traits, so in this case, if you had brown eyes from one parent and brown eyes from the other parent, you'd have brown eyes. If you had two recessive traits, so if you had blue eyes from one parent and blue eyes from the other parent, you would have blue eyes. But if you had one dominant trait and one recessive trait, meaning that if one of your parents gave you blue eyes and the other parent gave you brown eyes, the dominant trait, brown eyes, is the one that would show. All right, now this allows us to do a little bit more interesting calculation on some questions. All right, so some other interesting dominant traits, though, that you should be familiar with is that brown hair is actually dominant to blonde hair. Another one we'll use often in mice is that black eyes in mice are dominant to red eyes in mice. And also having attached earlobes is dominant to having unattached earlobes. All right, now this really allows you to start thinking about how traits get passed down from generation to generation. Since it's a 50-50 split, each person is kind of a unique mixture from each parent. So in this case, let's take a look at some of the questions on the back of your genetic traits reading. All right, the work together questions are questions 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to go through those together. What you should do is every time we get to a question, you should pause, try to answer the question on your own, and then I'll give you the answer. This way you can kind of see how well you're doing. If you get it wrong, you should go back to a part in the video or re-listen to the explanation carefully. If you get all 4 questions right, you're ready to move on to the work on your own questions on your own, and then ready to take the quiz. Let's start with the first one. Brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes. If a person inherits a brown eye gene from their mom and a blue eye gene from their dad, what color eyes will this person have? Well, this one's pretty basic, so let's look at this situation. If a person inherits a brown eye gene from their mom, so mom donates a brown eye gene, and a blue eye gene from their dad, what color eyes will they have? Well, what do you think? Hopefully you said brown, because brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes, so if they have both the dominant and the recessive trait, the dominant one, brown, will show. Let's take a look at the next question, number 2. Now this one is a similar question, just phrased differently. Instead of saying brown or blue, we're talking about the actual protein that the genes are coding for. In this case, the question is, both of mom's genes make eumelanin, and both of dad's genes make eumelanin. What color eyes will those children have, and how do you know? Well, remember from what we talked about before, eumelanin is the protein responsible for making brown eyes. So if both of mom's genes make eumelanin, that means that both of mom's genes are brown. Now, both of dad's genes also make eumelanin, which means both of dad's genes are brown, which means that dad has to give a brown-eyed gene to his kid. Mom has to give a brown-eyed gene to his kid. And so the little kid here, if it has a brown-eyed gene and a brown-eyed gene, of course would have brown eyes. All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay, now this is a similar question, but it gets a little tricky because you actually have to work backwards. In this case, we know what the kid looks like and we know what the mom looks like, but we don't know what the dad looks like. So let's read the question. Jose has brown eyes and his mom has blue eyes. What color eyes did Jose's dad have? Now let's think about this for a second. Jose has brown eyes. Since brown is the dominant trait, we know that at least one of Jose's 2 genes has to be a brown-eyed gene. We don't really know what the other one is. All right, the other gene could be blue and Jose would still have brown eyes, or he could have a brown-eyed gene and a brown-eyed gene and he'd have brown eyes. So this other gene that he has is kind of a mystery. The important part here, though, is that we know what mom's looks are. All right, mom has blue eyes, which means that both of her proteins only are phosphomelanin, only the blue protein. All right, the only way to get blue eyes is to have 2 recessive genes. In this case, then, since mom has a blue and a blue, the only thing that she can donate to little Jose here is a blue-eyed gene. Now, in order for Jose to have brown eyes, he has to have a brown-eyed gene from somewhere. The only place this could have come from was dad. Now, since one of dad's genes was brown, we know that his eye color has to be brown, because we don't need to know what the other one is because brown is the dominant trait. All right, so in this case, Jose's dad had brown eyes. Now, that one was a little bit tricky. Let's see if we can move on to question number 4. Now we're moving on from a different trait, and we're no longer looking here at eye color. We're actually adding in a new trait. As long as at least one of a person's two genes makes the correct form of the hemoglobin protein, the person will not have sickle cell anemia. Now let's get a little bit of background. So the hemoglobin protein, remember, is responsible for moving oxygen around in the bloodstream. It's what picks up oxygen in the alveoli and the lungs. Now, for each trait, you have two different genes, one from mom, one from dad. In this case, the question is saying if mom has a sickle cell anemia and dad has sickle cell anemia, will their child have sickle cell anemia? Why or why not? Now, this is a two-step process because this is the first thing we need to do is we don't know if sickle cell anemia is dominant or sickle cell anemia is recessive because it's going to be a different answer depending on which one it is. Let's take a look at the description. As long as at least one of a person's two genes makes the correct form of hemoglobin protein, the person will not have sickle cell anemia. In order to figure out if it's dominant or recessive, we need to essentially make this chart here down at the bottom. It's not really a chart, it's just our different options essentially. Every person has two genes for every trait. So in this case, you have really three options. You can make the correct form of hemoglobin and the correct form of hemoglobin, so both parents gave you the correct form. You can make the correct form and an incorrect form. So in this case, one parent gave you working hemoglobin, the other parent gave you non-working hemoglobin. Or you could also make the incorrect gene and make the incorrect gene because one parent gave you the incorrect copy and the other parent also gave you the incorrect copy. Those are the only three combinations that possibly exist. All right. The only one that's commonly confused is this option right here. And people say, well, what if your mom gave you the correct one and your dad gave you the incorrect one? Or what if you flipped it and your dad gave you the correct one and your mom gave you the incorrect one? It's the same thing either way. Most of your genes do not care whether which one came from your mom and which one came from your dad. So really, we only have these three options here. So what we need to do is we need to think about if you were this person in each of these three circumstances, what would happen to you? So let's take the first one. If you made the correct form of hemoglobin and you made the correct form of hemoglobin, would you have sickle cell anemia? Take a second and think about it. The answer here is you would not have hemoglobin. And the reason behind that comes from the question. It says as long as at least one of a person's two genes makes the correct form of hemoglobin, the person will not have sickle cell anemia. So what that means is if you make both correct forms, you will not have sickle cell. Now let's take a look at the next one. What if one of your genes made the correct form and one of your genes made the incorrect form? Would you have sickle cell anemia? Think about it for a second. Again, the answer here is no. And the reason behind it comes from the exact same underline we had before, because as long as at least one of a person's genes makes the correct form, the person will not have sickle cell. So what that means is that if you're making the correct form and the incorrect form, you will still not have sickle cell. Incidentally, you don't want this disease. It causes your blood cells to be shaped like little crescent moon blades. They can actually cut through your blood vessels. It could be very painful. What if we go to this last one? What if you made the incorrect form and you also made the incorrect form? So one of your parents gave you a broken gene and the other parent gave you a broken gene. Would you have sickle cell? In this case, you would. This is the case where you would have sickle cell. Now, why did we do this? Well, we did this to figure out which one of these is dominant and which one's recessive. Is it dominant to not have sickle cell? Or is having sickle cell a dominant disease? Well, if we look, what we can see is that we have three options. Two of our three options cause us to not have sickle cell, and only one option causes us to have sickle cell. That means that in this case, not having sickle cell is the dominant trait. Now, you might be asking yourself, why do we go through all this? Well, in order to answer this question, we actually need this information. So here's the same question, and here's, let's call him Marco in this case. All right, Marco has two parents. All right, in this case, we see that dad has sickle cell anemia and mom has sickle cell anemia. Since we learned here that having sickle cell anemia is the recessive form, the only way to get the recessive form is to have two recessive traits, meaning that both of dad's genes must be mutated, and both of mom's genes must be mutated. Now, the sad thing for Marco here is that since both of dad's genes are mutated, the only thing he can give Marco is a mutated gene, and so can mom. Which means that poor Marco here, will he have sickle cell anemia? Yes. He will have to have sickle cell anemia because both parents can only give a mutated copy of the hemoglobin gene. Poor Marco. Okay, now if you got all of those right, you should feel free to move on and read and answer the rest of the genetic trait questions. So those are the work on your own questions, 5, 6, 7, and 8. They're very similar to the questions we just did. They're just adding in some different traits, talking about hair color and talking about lactose intolerance. After you're done with that, you should take the quiz on genetic traits. Good luck on the quiz.